Hello, wonderful friends. Welcome back to Institute. So glad you would be willing to take some time and out of your schedule to watch this video version of Institute. My apologies for those that the Thursday class doesn't work for in the day. I apologize if that messed with your schedule, but um, I still think the opportunity to do Institute at kind of your own time, in your own place, still is a great opportunity. So we're going to be studying the Doctrine and Covenants this year, and I'm excited to spend some time in Doctrine and Covenants. And I know we're spending that time at other parts of our church study as well, so thought it might make sense to let's just do the same thing. So hopefully you're okay with that. And I'm excited to well, let me say this: I'm not great at history, so dates and names and whatnot that doesn't come easy for me. But something I do love about the Doctrine and Covenants is the relatable stories, and so I hope as we learn and study about people that you find some applicability to what you see they're going through to your life. So um, we're going to start tonight in lesson 2 and 3. So we're going to start in section 1. But each week we'll be doing 2 sections. So next week we'll be doing, or 2 lessons. So we'll be doing lessons 4 and 5 in the Doctrine and Covenants student manual. So I would invite you to study that, read that, and come ready next week to have an experience as you do this video on your own. So I want to begin today by talking about two very familiar feelings or experiences in life. Maybe I'm revealing too much, but about regret and excuses. And I'm saying that because I feel like the sections that we talk about these very human experiences, but put them in a light that the gospel could only put them in. And so think about regret and excuses as we get going on this. Excuses is almost a part of I feel like life, and so talk about that. I don't know if you remember this story. This is from mid 2010, between 2000s, about 2004, if I remember right. But there was you probably might be remember this, but there was a large tsunami in Thailand, and the Moken people are very isolated people that live off Thailand and Burma, I believe, as well. And they're I think their nickname is Sea Gypsies. I've been reading about them lately, but they live in the water, above the water. They die by the water, and their world is the water. In fact, science has kind of shown they've studied them. This group of people can see under the water twice as good as any other human being under the water. They can breathe longer underwater. Their heart rate slows down. Anyways, there's all these things kind of fascinating and interesting. But the Moken people have studied the sea for years. They've had elders, if you will, in their village, in their people that have learned about how to read the water. And when this tsunami was coming, um, an interesting thing occurred. I'm going to escape here for a second. I want to show you a clip from 60 Minutes. It's not a great clip, so I apologize. But just listen to this experience that they had. Now, since I'm showing you this video, you're probably 3 steps ahead of me as you listen to the experience from the Moken people and what happened. There's some interesting parts of this story and ultimately, obviously, what happened with the tsunami was incredibly sad and devastating. But interestingly enough, because these people listened to somebody who had studied and knew the signs, and it's interesting that they didn't do it till he walked out and showed them that they finally went to higher ground, and they were saved. Um, just to answer this on your own, think about it for a second. Why do you think that some people wouldn't listen or believe the elders' warnings? What was it? You can pause it if you want and think about that. But he even mentions one of the things. He said it hadn't happened for a long time. And as I thought about it when he said that, I thought that's pretty true in our even our own life. That sometimes we kind of get comfortable because something hasn't happened, or we haven't maybe had a trial or a challenge or something in our life that gets us to reevaluate. And I thought how interesting that same with them hadn't happened for a long time. They didn't believe him, and I think there's a gospel. There's a lot of gospel truth into that. So I say that as context to section 1. The Doctrine and Covenants is not chronological, and so we're going to be talking about people that we'll talk about later and learn more about, but they're introduced here. And really by this time, this is about 1831, end of 1831, there had been about 60 revelations that the prophet had received for him, for the church, the membership of the church, and leaders of the church, Sidney Rigdon, Oliver Cowdery, and William McClellan, thought that it would be important to publish these. And as you may already know, this was to be called the Book of Commandments. And they got together to write a preface. Well, for various reasons, they couldn't. They just couldn't get it written. And basically, section 1 in the Doctrine and Covenants is the Lord giving Joseph Smith the preface to what this book is supposed to do. I love this part of the story just because of the idea that here they were doing something, they'd been doing something, he'd had 60 revelations already. Now the Lord comes and says, here's why. And I think about in my own life how often I've had things occur, and it wasn't till maybe later that I understood, and maybe not even still, why I was doing something, why I needed to deal with something, if you will. Go with me to section 1 and verse 4, thinking about this story with the Moken people. Look at this wave. I want you to think about how is that voice of warning shared? Hey, a wave's coming. In the gospel sense, how are we told? Verse 4 in section 1, and the voice of warning shall be unto all people by the mouth of my disciples, whom I've chosen in these last days. You know, as you look at conference in the last year, even the last 2 years, I think you could go back and find some very distinct things that we've been warned about. And there's also some things that sound nice and are a very kind invitation, but are also a warning. One of the things we've heard constantly over the last year is to hear him. And I know because of the videos that the church produces that we sometimes think, oh, I should do that. That sounds good. I should be better at that. But it's a warning. It's a warning that we're being given, that we should be working on hearing him more often in our lives. There's another warning in verse 10. If you would take a minute, pause, and read verse 10. And you can either just, identify it or read between the lines here. But there is a warning, a couple warnings, I think, in verse 10. Pause it and read that, and then come back. Verse 10 talks about the Lord shall come to recompense unto every man according to his work. And when the warning that I think is something that we should consider here is kind of the law of the harvest idea that we will be, he'll come to recompense us for what we've done and maybe what we haven't done, if you will. And today is a day of work. We have been asked to do things and not do things. And when he comes, we'll be recompensed for that. And also, you and I both know that we're ultimately, really, grace and mercy come as a part of this. We'll be recompensed more, but there is importance in obeying the commandments of God because of the law of recompense, the law of the harvest. Go to verse 14, if you would. Let's read verse 14 connected to that. I've already kind of answered this in a way, but addressed it. But What happens if we don't hear? What happens if we don't do the work? In verse 14, it uses a scriptural phrase that in many ways might sound a little bit harsh, but that will be cut off. And if we don't hear, if we don't listen. And the opposite of that's true, right? So if we're cut off, if we don't do it, we're cut off. If not, we won't be cut off. We can feel his guidance, we can feel his presence, and ultimately return to him. You take a minute and do this again on your own, listening to this, pause and look for any other gospel truth in this section in verses 37, 38, 39. I'm going to focus in on verse 38 here, connected to what we've talked about. But I love the phrase here, and it's something that the Lord, like everything else, is the perfect example of, in that he says, what I've spoken, and I excuse not myself. Obviously, we know the Lord was perfect, but in reading that phrase, I think about how often, and maybe more as an adult, I don't do it as much verbally, but mentally, even spiritually, I make these excuses. And you probably can relate to that. I hope you can. I hope I'm not alone. But I make these excuses, and I do verbally too. My wife could verify that. But as we look to the Lord, we try to be more like him. I think what you and I find is we begin to make less excuses, and we take responsibility for things that we do. I have 4 kids, and it's fascinating to see how most of them, and they're younger, so I get it. If something is brought up to them about not doing something they're supposed to do, their immediate response is some kind of hey, my sister did this to me, so I couldn't, and some kind of an excuse. I have one child, so I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for all my kids, but I have one that if you ever bring anything up to her, she immediately says, I'm so sorry. And it's almost like just this immediate response that comes from her. And she's a great example to me of being better at that. But the Lord doesn't make excuses, and nor should we. As we close here, and I already had this up, but making excuses are always kind of funny, frankly. But as we end here, in the next lesson that covers section 3 and section 10, it's the infamous story of the 116 pages that Martin Harris lost, basically. And the backstory, really quickly, is I think we should probably look at Martin and his wife with a lot more mercy. He was involved in a work that he believed in, and his wife didn't really know or understand, and he was spending their hard-earned money on this work to publish and to do things to allow the church to grow. And the story goes that, Joseph asked the Lord multiple times, can I give him the transcripts? And he kept asking, and he finally said yes, and he gave it to him. And the Lord, knowing what would happen, that they would be lost, and the Lord tells him not to retranslate. He does have some consequences for his choice, and Martin and both Joseph almost feel like this is the worst thing that's going to happen to them. But what's this interesting to me in section 3, verse 10, the Lord reminds him, you're still chosen. You are still chosen. And as I think about regret, this idea of what regret does to us, I don't think anywhere else in church history Joseph brings this up again. He knew the Lord still believed and trusted him, and he didn't live in regret. And I love that story that we're taught through that. Lord bless you this week. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great week, my friends. Take care. Bye-bye.